Warning: this episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Give us 1 hour and we'll help you change the way you think about happiness. Harvesting Happiness with Lisa Cypers Kamen is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. Each week, Lisa spotlights diverse trendsetters and change agents who are the greatest contemporary thinkers and doers, devoting their lives to creating a better world in which to live. Your host, Lisa Cypers Kamen, is a widely recognized applied positive psychology expert, author, documentary filmmaker, and lecturer specializing in optimal lifestyle management. Let's get to it. Here's Lisa.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us on today's show, where you will learn how to feed emotional freedom, how neuroscience and nutrition nourish mental health. My first guest is Dr. Jetson Brewer. He is an internationally renowned addiction psychiatrist and neuroscientist. He is an associate professor in the School of Public Health and Medical School at Brown University. His 2016 TED Talk, A Simple Way to Break a Bad Habit, has been viewed more than 16 million times. He has trained Olympic athletes and coaches, government ministers, and business leaders. And he's in the house with me talking about his newest book, Unwinding Anxiety. New science shows how to break the cycles of worry and fear to heal your mind. Judd, thanks for joining me. I hope I can call you that.
Oh, please do. And thanks for having me.
Oh, it is a pleasure, because this is like one of my favorite topics, like what goes on under the human hood and how we can heal and how we can grow and how we can be better selves. Everyone experiences anxiety. I mean, I don't think there's a living, breathing creature on the planet that doesn't, except maybe zebras, according to Robert Sapolsky.
Yes, it's funny. They certainly have similar fear responses and learning mechanisms, but they have learned, or perhaps we have unlearned, that they can do things like jumping and kicking as a way to release those, they're, kind of calm down very quickly once danger is over. Whereas we as humans have kind of taken the opposite. We pick that up and we start carrying that around like a big, heavy load of rocks. And we just add to things that don't necessarily need adding to.
Interesting. So what you're saying is our four-legged zebra cousins just expel all that energy physically, and the two-legged relatives, we just internalize it.
Not always, but often we do. This is where anxiety comes from. So you can think of a fear response as helping us learn. So if the zebra is chased by what do they get chased by? Lions? Not my field. But let's say a zebra is chased by a lion and it gets away. Okay, what it learns is, lions are over in that part of the savannah. I should probably avoid that part of the savannah. But they don't go about the rest of the day ruminating over, why did I go there? Do I have a death wish? Did any other zebras see how idiotic I was? Did I look stupid? We as humans, we're unique, at least as far as we know, in the ability to both ruminate, worry about things that we've done in the past, and also perseverate, worry about things that we might do in the future.
I love that word, perseverate. That's the vocab word of the day, everybody. It's a good word. So when we talk about anxiety, though, and how it affects our brains, right? It kind of makes us stupid. Like when we get in that anxious state, like that thinking mind, the executive functioning part of our brain kind of disconnects, right?
It does. So you can think of that the neocortex, the newer part of our brain, helps us survive in a different way than these basic survival mechanisms in the sense that it takes previous information, projects it into the future, and helps us think and plan. So that's helpful. Yet when we don't have enough information or there's something that's very uncertain, anxiety is all about something with worrying about something with an uncertain outcome. When it's really uncertain, our brains go into hyperdrive trying to think of all the worst case scenarios. What if this, what if that, what if this, what if that? And so we actually burn out our engine, so to speak, by trying to think and plan. But in fact, we can't think and plan when we get anxious. Our prefrontal cortex goes offline.
And yet, anxiety at its deepest root, I think you touched upon this, is there in a certain sense to keep us aware and vigilant and safe, but then it goes on tilt.
Well, I would say that there's actually a distinction between that vigilance, that arousal that's physiologic, and the anxiety piece. And we can actually differentiate these pretty simply. I write about this a little bit in the book, but my lab did a study where we actually looked at a bunch of different mental states and had people rate whether they were open or closed, for example. Does this feel open? Does this feel closed? Anxiety feels closed. And in fact, if you look at the time scale of that, think of the zebra, it doesn't have time to get anxious about the lion. It just runs. So we share this with the zebras. We see danger, we run, and afterwards we freak out about it. And that freak out is what closes us down. That part is, I think, pretty different than these physiologic survival mechanisms.
So when we talk about the freak out, the human freak out, and trying to recalibrate after these events occur, tell us what we can do about it. Tell us how our brain can be taught new tricks to manage anxiety when it presents.
Well, the first piece is, so I think of this as a 3-step process, and I actually set up the book in that way, part 1, 2, and 3. The first step is actually just mapping out how our minds work. If we don't know that anxiety can actually be driven by certain behaviors, then we're not going to be able to work with that. So a feeling of anxiety is something that comes up. There's not a whole lot we can do about that besides not react to it and work with it differently, which I'll talk about. But there are pieces that we actually add to it. The freak out piece often comes in several flavors. One is the flavor of worrying. So we feel anxious. I'm thinking about my patients with generalized anxiety disorder. They wake up in the morning, they feel anxious, and then they start worrying about why they're anxious. That worry piece is optional. And in fact, it drives future anxiety because our brain gets this reward where it either feels like it's in control or it distracts us from, the worst feeling of anxiety. And that feeds back and drives more anxiety because our brain has learned, this is worrying because I feel like I'm doing something is better than just sitting and wallowing in the anxiety itself. So worry is a big piece of this. Procrastination, stress eating, binge watching Netflix, going on social media, all of these are these echo habit loops on top of anxiety that give us temporary distractions, but then just they don't fix the anxiety. And then they also add their own problems. In the last year, we had, what was called first the quarantine 15 as people were gaining weight. And then they called it the quarantine 20 and the quarantine 30 as people keep gaining weight because thinking, when's this thing going to be over?
And there's only so much bread you can make.
Yes, indeed.
But I think what you're also talking about when we resort to these self-soothing behaviors that might not actually be so good for us, right? Going back to the analogy with the zebra bucks and gets it out physically. The human will, go on social media, will eat, will drink, will self-soothe, all in pursuit of some chemical release of pleasure that temporarily takes us out of what is.
Absolutely.
So that's what we're after, right? We're after the dopamine jolt.
Well, I would say dopamine's kind of been mislabeled as a pleasure molecule. It's not really. It's really a molecule that helps us learn things. So it's been associated with pleasure. But if you talk to any of my patients who are addicted to these dopaminergic agents like cocaine, basically any drug increases dopamine amounts in the brain. Dopamine drives, it actually drives behavior. So it says, go do something, like go get the drink, go get the cocaine, go get the, heroin, whatever, go get your phone, right?
Go get that bread.
Right. Go get that bread. So the dopamine drives us into action. That's not pleasurable. It's saying do something now. The pleasurable aspects are probably related to other molecules in the brain. So what I think people are looking for is, it again goes back to this basic learning mechanism. Something unpleasant happens, And then our brain says, make this go away. So we do something to make that go away. That's very basic negative reinforcement, where something unpleasant happens, we do a behavior that makes it go away. And then the reward is the decrease in that negative feeling.
And what you're suggesting in the book, Unwinding Anxieties, we get to know how our brains work a little bit better so we can work with the brain and retrain it.
Yes, that's the first step. If we don't know how our minds work, how can we possibly work with them?
So when we talk about mind mapping, which you've written about in the book, you talk about triggers, behaviors, and results. Tell us a little bit about how we, as the average person, can begin to identify these routines that we have that get ourselves all twisted up, and then work with them and ease that discomfort or that dis-ease that we feel.
I'll give an example of a patient and then talk about how we can all do this. So I actually had a patient who came in who was referred for anxiety, and he didn't know how his mind works. So the first thing we did, I pulled out a piece of paper on my desk and just wrote down trigger, behavior, result, and asked him, as I was taking his history, I started filling that in. So for him, the behavior was he would avoid driving on the highway because he started to get these thoughts that he was going to get in a car accident. So the thoughts would trigger his behavior, which was to avoid driving on the highway. And then the result was that he didn't have those distressing thoughts. Yet it was also causing major problems for him because he was really severely limited in his mobility. So that's, any of us can do this. We can just, and we even put a free habit mapper out, and people can just go to mapmyhabit.com and they can download this, where you can print out a piece of paper and find what your triggers are, what the behavior is, and what's the result. And I usually start by having people focus on what the behavior is, because that's the easiest piece to identify. And then they can map backwards and map forwards from there.
So when somebody comes to you and says, I'm so anxious, I'm overwrought with anxiety, I can't do, and then everybody fills in their blanks, whatever, I can't lead a normal life in this way. How do you help somebody unpack it, repackage that, and begin to function again?
Well, this is something where I hadn't actually learned this in residency training or medical school, but this really focuses on how anxiety can be driven as a habit. So after this first step of mapping, the next step is helping our brain see how unrewarding that behavior is. And I'll give a concrete example. My lab's done studies with this, where, for example, with people who are overeating, we can give them an app-based mindfulness training program it's called Eat Right Now. Anybody can download it. And it's basically where we have them pay attention as they overeat. And then we can measure the reward value, basically the reward value in their brain, in terms of how that reward value changes when they pay attention as they overeat. And what they realize is that overeating doesn't actually feel that great. We do the same thing with people who are trying to quit smoking. We have them pay attention as they smoke cigarettes. They realize that cigarettes taste like crap. So we can do the same thing. And in fact, it only takes 10 to 15 times of somebody really paying attention as they do these consummatory behaviors, for example, to help that reward value drop below the reward value of not doing the behavior. So They start to shift their behavior. Yes.
15 times? Wow. That's actually pretty quick.
Well, our brains have to be plastic. It can't be like we get chased by lions 100 times before we learn that they're dangerous. We'll be dead.
True. That is the truth. I can see how that makes sense. We're going to need to take a break. And when we continue the conversation with Dr. Judson Brewer, we're going to learn more about how our brains have changed in the year of the pandemic. We're going to learn more about how curiosity and kindness are the neurological antithesis to anxiety. I'm really interested in that, and I hope you will be too. To learn more about Dr. Brewer's work, please visit drjudd.com, and you can go drjudd.com/mind mapping to access that PDF he was talking about. On Twitter, you can find Judd at Judd Brewer, on Facebook, Dr. Judd Apps, and on Instagram, Dr. Judd. We're talking about unwinding anxiety. New science shows how to break the cycles of worry and fear to heal your mind. We'll be right back. Hang on just a minute. I want to share a little secret about myself. I am a health-conscious, clean freak germaphobe who keeps a super tidy home using green products. For years, I've been a subscriber to Grove Collaborative for all my eco-friendly household needs. So I'm super excited to show some love for today's sponsor, Grove Collaborative, delivering a greener clean to keep your home and our world spotless with earth-friendly cleaning essentials. Healthy plant-based, non-toxic cleaning products really do work, and the good ones are actually more enjoyable to use. But where do you start and who do you trust? That's where Grove Collaborative comes in. Grove is the online marketplace that delivers healthy home, beauty, and personal care products directly to your doorstep. Grove Collaborative takes the guesswork out of going green. Browse the site for thousands of home, beauty, and personal care products, all guaranteed to be good for you, your family, your home, and our planet. With Grove, it's a one-stop shop for all your natural goods. This saves time, money, and hassle. I'm a huge fan of Grove's heavenly blood orange scented hand sanitizer. So why not join me and more than 2 million households who trust Grove Collaborative to make their homes happier and healthier. Shipping is fast and free on your first order. Making the switch to natural products has never been easier. For a limited time, when my listeners go to grove.co/happiness, you will get to choose a free gift with your first order of $30 or more. But you have to use our special code. Go to grove.co/happiness to get your exclusive offer. That's grove.co/happiness. Let's take a break. We'll be right back.
To learn more about cultivating sustainable well-being at home and the office, visit harvestinghappiness.com and explore Lisa's experiential on-site brain fitness workshops, corporate programming, and speaking engagement services.
Welcome back. Before we get back to it, let's talk about the games we played as kids. In my family, we were big on jigsaw puzzles, board games, and cards. Playing games passed the time on rainy days and any day we needed a little something to cure boredom. One thing was certain, good times were had by all. And today, Best Fiends is my favorite casual mobile puzzle game with more than 100 million downloads. What I love most is that Best Fiends challenges me to use my brain in new ways to strategize and conquer new levels. This gives me a shot of adrenaline that makes me feel like a winner. I'm working my way towards level 4,000 and counting. I've been playing Best Fiends for more than a year and I'm happily hooked. And if you're anything like me, you will be too. The fun never ends at Best Fiends because there is always something new to explore. There's no game over. With thousands of puzzle levels, you'll never run out of goals to achieve. Don't blame me if you end up kind of obsessed and find yourself playing in strange places. If you're itching for a little fun, come join me for a good time. Download the 5-star rated puzzle game Best Fiends free today on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. Now let's get back to the conversation. And we're back exploring emotional freedom, how neuroscience and nutrition can nourish our mental health. Let's get back to the conversation with my guest, Dr. Judson Brewer. So Judd, let's go back to the year annus horribilis, right? Like here, we've had this year of completely upending life as we know it. And our brains have changed as a result of a year of living differently, and that's being nice.
Yes, I guess one way you could look at that is a year of living anxiously.
Yeah.
and that, that really comes even BC, before COVID-19, which seems like ancient history. There was a rise in anxiety. Anxiety was going up across, at least in the United States.
Oh, for 5 years.
Yes. Yes. And a lot of that, when we saw this huge spike in this last year, a lot of that has to do with really these basic survival mechanisms of our brains. You can think of our stomach rumbling, saying, hey, go get some food, you're hungry. Well, our brain rumbles in the same way when there is uncertainty. You can think of our ancestors out on the savannah If they go out into a new territory that they haven't mapped out yet, they don't know if there's danger there. So that uncertainty drives them to get information to map that out. And then once they learn it's either safe or dangerous, they can either go back there or avoid it. And then they become comfortable. They extend that part of the savanna into their comfort zone, so to speak, because it's been mapped. So when there's a lot of uncertainty, our brains really go off the rails trying to find information. And one piece here is, for some reason, we've kind of learned to go on social media to get information, whether it's our Twitter feeds or whatever. And while there can be information that's helpful out there, there's a whole lot of information that is either opinion or stilted or even, intentionally misleading. And so we have to sort through all of that information to try to make sense of it. And, in ancient times, there was no such thing as a deep fake saber-toothed tiger. It was real and you ran. So here, we don't have to look at the opinion blogs in terms of whether saber-toothed tigers will actually eat people or not. In modern day, we have to try to sort through the information ourselves. We have to become an expert in everything, which we can't possibly do. And so that really just overheats our brains as well. So, our survival brains go online, try to get information, and yet it's either too much information or they can't tell what's worth believing or not. And then we just spin out into more anxiety. On top of that, there's a ton of uncertainty. It's not just things physically related, like virus related, but it's economy, it's schools, it's, environment, it's all these things added to it.
And so how has our brain changed? I mean, physically, how has it changed, and what to do about it? Is it we're just in that constant state of fear and panic? So it's just drip, 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 drip. And sort of the train has left the station and then we can't reel it back? Or how do we sort of calm our systems down?
Yeah, the good news is our brains are very plastic. So as quickly as we can learn something, we can unlearn it. And this really relies on understanding how our brains work. So I write a lot about this in the book. It's really based on how rewarding a behavior is. So as I mentioned, some of this work with eating and smoking, we can apply this to anxiety as well. For example, if we are in this habit of worrying, maybe we see something uncertain, we start worrying, oh, is this going to apply to me? Is this true? Is this whatever? Is this dangerous? Basically, we can ask ourselves, is this worrying solving the problem, keeping my family safe, helping me in any way? The general answer is no, but it's not an intellectual question that we're asking here. It's really feeling into our direct experience and seeing, what is this doing? And I summarize that for my patients and for folks in reading the book. Basically, it's asking one simple question: what am I getting from this? Right?
Reward, the ultimate reward from the behavior.
Yes. And if it's not rewarding, then our brains will start to become disenchanted with it, whether it's stress eating, worrying, procrastinating, whatever.
This is like the aha moment. If we can just slow our roll enough to ask this question, I guess at least, what did you say, 16 times? Right? 10
to 15 times, yes.
Right?
You could, to be safe, at least 16. But it really depends on how much somebody is paying attention. The more closely we pay attention every single time, the more quickly our brain will learn it.
So in the case of, let's say, substance abuse addictions, how do we get patients, clients, loved ones who some have been over imbibing in the past year to take a look at that?
Well, funny you mentioned that, because I write about one of my patients in my clinic who was in the book, who was referred to me for anxiety, but he was referred to me for alcohol use disorder. And it turned out that his primary issue was anxiety. So the first thing that I had him do was map out his habits around drinking. And it was basically, he would get anxious, he would drink. And then, he would basically numb himself, or he'd avoid those anxious feelings. Yet, he'd drink a lot at night, and then the next morning he'd have a hangover. He'd feel even more anxious because he hadn't gotten his work done and the first thing we did was help him start to see that process. And in fact, he quit drinking once he realized what the issue was, because, he realized that this drinking wasn't actually fixing his anxiety, and he needed to address the anxiety.
This is very powerful to me, like what you're just describing, that if we can get people we love and care about and work with to see that they actually have more power over themselves, not the external, but over themselves and their own reactions, everybody stands a fighting chance of managing and soothing their anxiety.
Yes, we often spend a lot of energy trying to change the world or external things that we have no control over. The only thing we have control over is ourselves. And the best way to get control over ourselves is not through willpower, as much as we'd like to believe that willpower is that muscle. It's more myth than muscle. It's really about just bringing awareness in and helping our brains see very clearly what we're getting from our behaviors. And then we start to say, to our brains start to say to themselves, do you really want to do that? It's not really helping.
Yeah, it's creating a whole lot more trouble than ultimately it's worth. And is it really putting oneself back in that comfort zone, right? Because we're seeking not to leave the comfort zone.
Yes, absolutely. And the irony here is we can tap into the same reward-based learning system and start to use the power of it to help us unlearn these old behaviors. And you're actually touching on a piece of this, which is learning to be comfortable with the discomfort. So instead of, staying in our comfort zone all the time to the point where every time we venture out, we freak out and we go into our panic zone, can we actually start to view that panic zone differently and view it as a growth zone?
And that's another way of looking at this past year. For some people, they have viewed the year as the growth zone. For others, they've been in a constant state of panic for months.
Yes.
I like this. I like this because it really does empower us to be the boss of our own lives.
Yes. And really the key ingredient here is not something exotic. It's simply awareness. Awareness.
It is very, very simple. And, practice makes permanent, or maybe there is no state of permanence, but it makes the shift, the state of shift, a permanent, reality, right? You can move from that high anxiety state to being, somebody who lives with appropriately anxious moments.
Yes. And in fact, what our brains will do consistently is always move toward things that are more rewarding. So in the third part of the book, I talk about what's called the BBO, the bigger, better offer. And in fact, there is a more rewarding aspect of experience that we can all tap into ourselves that actually helps us move into the growth zone. It's curiosity.
You mentioned, and this has got my full attention, curiosity and kindness are the neurological antithesis to anxiety. I want to repeat that because that is pretty frickin' powerful, right? Curiosity and kindness are the neurological antithesis to anxiety. And some people say, well, what do you mean by that? I'm supposed to be nice to myself when I'm feeling like I'm out of control.
Yes. So this isn't about platitudes or, just thinking positive thoughts.
Right.
That's what I love about positive psychology. It's about finding things that are naturally, uplifting and not manufacturing things. Because our brains, it's hard. It's a little hubristic to think that we can outthink our brains.
That's funny. Really funny.
Yeah. Our brains know best, and they do. My lab did a study where we looked at a bunch of different mental states to see which ones were most rewarding, let's say. And it's probably a no-brainer for anybody listening to think of their own experience. So anxiety feels much worse than curiosity. And so here we can actually hack the process. We can when we're anxious, we can get curious about what anxiety feels like. And one of the pieces here, another thing that we looked at was, do these mental states feel a certain way? Is there a common language that we can all look at, touch in on from our own perspective? And there is. Simply put, anxiety feels closed and contracted, and curiosity feels open and expanded. And you can't be closed and open at the same time. So if we're closed down in anxiety, all balled up in a tight little ball of anxiety, we can actually get curious, and that starts to open it up right in that moment.
Which brings me to mindfulness and meditation and a different way of viewing this type of practice. Because you write that meditation is nice, but you don't need to practice it to reap its benefits. And I think this is where you're going with this.
Yes. Some of my lab's research. So we did a study with smoking and used mindfulness training to help people quit smoking. We got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment in this study. Yes. And in fact, I'll mention, we even have studied app-based mindfulness training programs. We even have one for anxiety called Unwinding Anxiety that anybody can download. And we did a study with it where we found we got a 57% reduction in clinically validated anxiety scores in anxious physicians. We got a 67% reduction in anxiety in people with generalized anxiety disorder. So from my own lab's research, we can see that this can actually be true. And what we found from some of those studies was what I call short moments many times. So when somebody is in the throes of a cigarette craving, for example, they can learn to bring a moment of awareness in and notice, there's a thought, there's a body sensation, there's an emotion. And that these things, that they are not their thoughts, they are not their emotions, they are not their body sensations. And by doing this, they can ride out these cravings. And so these short moments in context can really help us change behaviors right, in vivo, right in those contexts, as compared to, I have a craving for a cigarette. And what do I do? If I'm on the highway, I pull over and pull out my meditation mat and start meditating on the side of the highway. Not very practical.
I want to go on, but we've run out of time. So I hope you will come back and continue this conversation, because I could do this with you all day long. I mean, there's so many little forks I'd like to, or alleyways I'd like to go down and talk about with you, So
I would be happy to. So anytime.
Come back.
Game on.
Come back and unwind anxiety here again on Harvesting Happiness. To learn more about Dr. Judson Brewer's work, please visit drjudd.com. Again, that's drjudd.com/mind mapping to find that freebie PDF to kind of get a glimpse into your own humanhood. And then on Twitter, you can find him at Judd Brewer, on Facebook at Dr. Judd Apps, and on Instagram, Dr.Judd. Thank you. I mean, really, this was phenomenal. I mean, you give us hope and you give us power through what you write and what you're teaching us. So thank you.
It's my pleasure.
We're going to take a brief pause and we'll be right back. That's a promise.
Did you know that happiness is actually good for your health? Happy people live longer, are more productive, and make better partners, parents, and professionals. Connect with us on Facebook at Harvesting Happiness and follow Lisa on Twitter at Lisa Kamen for a daily dose of inspiration.
And we are back, continuing our exploration of feeding emotional freedom, how neuroscience and nutrition can help nourish our mental health. My next guest is Professor Julia J. Rucklidge, is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Canterbury. Over the last decade, she's been running clinical trials investigating the role of broad-spectrum micronutrients in the treatment of mental illness, and recently developed an international free online course for the public on nutrition and mental health. She's written a book, The Better Brain, Overcoming Anxiety, Combat Depression, and Reduce ADHD and Stress with Nutrition. Julia, thanks for joining me on the show. I am really, really excited to talk with you about this subject.
I am also delighted to talk about this work with you, Lisa.
We've been through a lot. The world has been through a lot in the last year. And I think, for me, in my view, one of the silver linings of all of this is that perhaps we each possess a little bit more empathy and compassion for the value that people who have mental health challenges experience?
Absolutely. Yes. I think that what we're recognizing is that more and more people are struggling with mental health issues as a consequence of the COVID environment and being locked up for so long, and even experiencing COVID and the long-term issues associated with that, or having a family member get sick or even die will have huge consequences on the mental health of the population.
Well, it's a trauma that everybody can relate to, because I think the statistic is 1 in 3 of us will have lost somebody, know somebody, or have lost somebody to COVID.
I know, it's huge. It's absolutely huge. And so we need to know how to build up what I'd like to call our mental resilience to cope with this onslaught of challenges that we're all experiencing.
And when you contrast dealing with trauma for the average person in the world versus how America, the United States, typically treats trauma, we are a heavily pharmacologically based society here. So the belief is that, we'll just write a pill for that, write a prescription for that. And what I know from my own work and your work and reading work of others is there's another way to manage our mental health through lifestyle interventions, including, but not limited to, what we consume.
Exactly. And so if I can dive in and start talking about what's in our book and what our message is.
Yes.
And just to let your listeners know is that this was co-written with my Ph.D. supervisor, Bonnie Kaplan, who is at the University of Calgary, which is where I did my Ph.D. So this is a joint effort. So to dive in is that what we really have noticed based on the research that we've both been involved in over the last over a decade is that we've been doing research that's been looking at the effects of giving people additional minerals and vitamins or micronutrients in a pill form to people who are struggling with mental health issues. And we do these in very controlled ways. We compare the nutrients to placebo. And what we've observed time over time is that the micronutrients outperform the placebo, which means that the fact that people are getting better in our clinical trials isn't just due to that feel-good, being looked after effect, that it's something in addition to that that we can really only explain by the additional nutrients. And so that got me thinking about, well, if we're having such an impact, a positive impact on people's mental health, and this is like stress, ADHD, low mood, feeling anxiety, poor sleep. Those are the types of things that we've been studying. Is that if you can see these huge changes, why is it? What's happening? Why is it that people are benefiting from additional minerals and vitamins? And so the fundamental thing is that, well, they're not getting it from their food. There's something missing. They aren't adequately nourished by the food that they've been eating. And so that suggests to me is that what's happening is that we have lost our nutritional resilience, the resilience that's conferred to us by having a full tank of gas. That is, making sure that you're giving your brain what it needs in order to be able to operate and to be reactive and to cope with what the environment is going to hit you with.
And is this because the quality of the food has diminished over time? Like, in other words, the soil is not as nutrient rich as it once was? Or is it because the average person is not consuming enough nutrient rich food, or both?
I think it's both. I think we go into quite a bit of detail in the book about the changes in our food production. And so we have a lot of mouths to feed. We have, over 7 billion people to feed in the world. And so we've had to do a lot of cutting, methods to try to ensure that we can grow crops really quickly, for example. And so we select crops that grow quickly. But when you do that, you reduce the opportunity of the plant to get the minerals out of the soil. And so the minerals are essential for the plant to make vitamins. And so then you end up with a plant that you may think is going to be nourishing, because we're always told to eat your fruits and vegetables and that kind of thing. But maybe that plant is less nourishing to you, or less nutrient dense than it used to be when we allowed the plants to grow in their natural and, under natural conditions. Now we accelerate growth. We use glyphosate or Roundup on our crops to try that they help the plants grow faster. So all of those environmental changes to how we're selecting our food could really be having an impact on our plant. And I say could. In fact, there's data to show that the soils are a lot more nutrient depleted than they should be relative to ideal. So there's that. And then what you also suggest is that we're also eating less nourishing food as well. And that's absolutely clear based on the data. If you look at North American data, American and Canadian, you see that the average American their diet consists of 50% of their calories comes from ultra processed food, and only less than 20%. So 20% is pushing it. Less than 20% of the American population is hitting their fruit and vegetable minimal daily intake. So when you put those two things together, you kind of go, okay, we've got plants that are less nourishing, and we're not eating enough of them anyway. And we're eating foods that are ultra processed, that are known to be depleted in these essential vitamins and minerals that our brain needs to be resilient. And so you put that together and you kind of go, this is a recipe for disaster. And no wonder we are having so many challenges when we're all faced with huge uncertainty and, difficulties in our lives.
Let me just jump in here and ask you a couple of questions. I wanted to touch upon vertical farming or hydroponic farming, indoor farming, and the effects of that on the nutrition of the plants and fruits and vegetables that we're eating.
Right. That's something that I don't know specifically around whether or not that's making it more nutrient dense. Do you know that, Lisa?
I don't. That's why I'm asking. Is there a reduction or improvement in nutrition density? That was my first question. And then my second question, which is now just flown out the window, but it will come back.
Okay.
It's okay. Life is like that. To specifically tell us some of these micronutrients that contribute to resiliency and strong mental health.
Sure. So the strong message that we have in our book is that there's no special nutrient. And I'm often asked, well, what nutrient should I be taking in order to sleep better or to have less anxiety? Because there's a lot of information out on the internet that if you just take magnesium, you're going to feel better, or if you just take some zinc, you'll feel better. And in fact, if you look at it from the perspective of the science and the biology and the biochemistry, you realize that there isn't a special nutrient. They're all required in combination together to be consumed together in order to be able to provide all of the ingredients for your brain to make the chemicals that it needs to, say, regulate your mood or regulate your anxiety. And those are things like that your listeners are probably familiar with, which is things like serotonin, which we know is involved in mood regulation, or your dopamine, which we know can influence whether you're impulsive or not, or help with your concentration. So those very important neurotransmitters that we're familiar with, your brain can't make them very well if you don't give it the ingredients it needs. And those ingredients, in part, are your vitamins and minerals. So that is your B6 or your thiamine or your vitamin D and vitamin C and zinc, etc. But all of them. So there's about 15 minerals and about 15 vitamins that have been deemed to be essential. It may be more, but that's about where we're at this stage to recognize that we need to get at least those in our body. And that's the research that I've been doing, is giving those essential nutrients and observing whether or not that has a positive effect on mental health issues.
So is the idea that we supplement, or is the idea that we remake our pantries and our refrigerators and fill them with the things that give these nutrients?
Absolutely. So the message that I'm giving based on our research that's been done on supplements is food first. So and that's based on the data, is that not enough people are eating good food. So let's start there. And this will not only be good for your mental health, it'll be good for your physical health too. So there's no downside to this. And that is reducing, or even I would say eliminating, your consumption of ultra processed foods. So those are the things that takes up to over 2/3 or even more of the products that are sold in supermarkets. So they're everywhere. They're in your gas stations, your petrol stations, and your all your dairies. What's that? I've lived here too long.
The ice cream shops.
The ice cream, not just the ice cream store, the stores where you just, 7-Eleven, like a 7-Eleven kind of store. Those types of stores, they're full of ultra processed food. You don't get a lot of whole, real foods in those types of environments or shopping environments or food swamps. So the first thing would be to reduce that consumption of those ultra processed foods, and then increase, of course, your consumption of real whole foods. So that would be, the best research on what's the best diet for your brain has been on the Mediterranean diet.
Yes.
And so as much as you can align yourself with that, and that's just increasing your fruits and vegetables. And I would say eat in season if you can. They tend to be cheaper and fresher. You would you're increasing your nuts, your legumes, your beans, your chickpeas, your fish is really good for your brain and your mental health. And reduce your consumption of your takeaways and that ultra processed stuff that you can purchase in most places, probably within a stone's throw away of your home.
Hang on one sec. I don't mean to interrupt, but we need to take a pause. So I want to send our listeners over to canterbury.ac.nz. So this is at Canterbury in New Zealand, University of Canterbury. And your profile is there to learn more about you. You can also connect with Dr. Julia Rucklidge on Twitter at Julia Rucklidge, on Facebook at Mental Health and Nutrition. And the free online course, is that living on the university site, or is that living?
No. It's on the edX platform. So EDX platform. And if you go in there and you type in my name, or if you type in mental health and nutrition, you'll be able to find it.
Wonderful. And the book we're talking about today is Professor Julia J. Rucklage's The Better Brain, Overcoming Anxiety, Combat Depression, and Reduce ADHD and Stress with Nutrition. Here comes a brief pause. We'll be right back, and that is a guarantee.
Who says money can't buy happiness? Whether you are a skeptic or seeker, check out Lisa's new book. Are we happy yet? 8 Keys to Unlocking a Joyful Life. A boot camp manual for greater emotional fitness is available at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, IndieBound, and HarvestingHappiness.com. Here's a truth bomb. Emotions are contagious, and happiness is a universally desired state. But we tend to forget that we all have the freedom to be happy or the liberty to be miserable each day, regardless of external circumstances. Explore the journey of human happiness, how to find it and keep it, with Lisa's documentary film, H Factor. Where is your heart? Visit HarvestingHappiness.com to learn more.
What is your happiness?
And we're back. Professor Julia J. Rucklidge and myself are talking about feeding emotional freedom, how neuroscience and nutrition can nourish mental health. Let's get back to the conversation. So, Julia, in the prior segment, you were talking about the importance of the Mediterranean diet as a one way or the best way to achieve all of the nutrients that we should be consuming.
Absolutely. And just to let your listeners know is that there's been a lot of research that's shown that the Mediterranean diet reduces your risk associated with mental health issues like depression and anxiety. And also there have been trials that have taken people who are on a really what we call a Western diet, and then taught them how to eat according to the Mediterranean style rules or guidelines, I think is a better word, and showed that improved their depression So in people who were depressed. And so that type of research has been replicated. So I feel really confident about saying, go Mediterranean style first. But then there are people who do that and they still struggle with mental health issues. And so then I would start to be wondering, well, why is that? And there'd be a whole bunch of different reasons for that. One of them is the one that we've talked about, which is that our food may not be as nourishing for our brain. And so maybe it's not adequately feeding some people who may need more, because we're all different. My metabolic needs for nutrients may be quite different from your metabolic needs. My need for zinc might be different from yours. So, and that can do with genetics. It could be a whole host of factors. It could be due to it could be due to being in an environment, for example, that has more depletion of zinc relative to another environment. I mean, zinc is probably not a good example for New Zealand, but our soils are very depleted in selenium. So I could be more depleted in that, if that makes sense. So it could be those things. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that selenium is the first thing that came to mind when you were talking about being starved for appropriate nutrition. Yeah. I mean, I know just from my own interest in the subject, and one of my children is studying to become a registered dietitian, and she is a big proponent of all of this and has a huge interest and educates me continually.
Great. Yeah. So that could be, one thing that's going on is even when we're eating well, we're not getting it. But then I would say that there are life things that can also influence our nutritional needs. And one of the ones that I've been really interested in is in stress. And that is either acute stress or chronic stress. And when I got interested in this because I lived through a whole bunch of earthquakes. In 2010, 2011, our city was rocked by it was only a 6.2 magnitude earthquake, but it was right under our city. And it was massive, and our city got destroyed, and we're still rebuilding, and 185 people died in a few buildings that collapsed. So it was a huge, huge event. And what I had done a study, we had the first earthquake started in September 2010, and that was a huge one, 7.1. That's not the one that destroyed the city, but it gave me an opportunity to ask the question of people who happened to be taking nutrients during that earthquake because they were enrolled in our clinical trials. How did they recover, like in terms of their anxiety and stress after experiencing that massive, trauma? And what we learned was that people who happened to be well nourished, getting these nutrients, while they got very stressed, they recovered far more quickly than people who weren't. So that was a natural experiment. We can't deliberately cause an earthquake in that level of stress. But we learned that from because I was in that kind of research environment where we could ask that question. So that tells me that you're more likely to overcome a stressor if you're already well nourished. Yeah. And so that was a remarkable finding. Then after the February earthquake that I just described, the 6.2 or 3, we then gave people nutrients and looked to see whether or not that helped them overcome the stress associated with having lived through that earthquake and all the subsequent aftershocks. And what we learned was indeed, yes, it helped. So they were more likely to recover than people who weren't taking nutrients. And then we replicated that after a flood that happened in Alberta, Canada. And then again, after a mosque, we had a terrible, atrocious mosque shooting, a shooting in 2 mosques in Christchurch. I know that's, unfortunately, that's the norm in the States for those types of events to happen, but really unusual for that to happen in New Zealand. But we had this opportunity again to give people nutrients to see how well whether or not it could help them with the recovery associated with being survivors. And it did. So I feel really confident about saying that it does seem like when you're under a lot of stress, your body, what it does, it's going to divert all the nutrients to make sure that your fight-flight response works, because that's all about survival. And there's very little left for everything else, like your regulation of your sleep and your anxiety and your mood. So we're topping it up at a time when you're getting depleted. And that, I think, is one of the most exciting results of the work that we've done, is to show that you need to keep replenishing yourself with these nutrients in order to be able to cope better with what's happening.
Something comes to mind as you share this, and this is with regards to like food justice and people who might not necessarily have the resources to purchase these high quality foods that you're speaking of. But what about if we make nutritional supplementation free and available?
I know. I mean, that would be wonderful because it may, as I said, it may be that eating good food isn't sufficient, although I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah.
Supplementation, unfortunately, isn't typically covered by either your insurance plans or any public healthcare system. So that is one of the huge, huge barriers. That's right. Yet. And I certainly lobby in New Zealand all the time to get them covered because we pay for drugs, but we don't pay for nutrients. And it's a complicated issue as to why it's like that, but it's probably partially got to do with big pharma's lobbying and incredible power. And so they are successful and they're going to keep the nutrient supplements out. And so they work very hard at discrediting this kind of work. And that means that there's less of a opportunity to be able to get it to be paid for by government or by insurance plans. So there's it's an uphill battle to get this changed. And also nutrients aren't patentable. And that also makes for a more difficult opportunity to get them paid for.
Thank you for bringing that up because that is an important point. And then when you, conversely, you look at the research that's been done on D3, for example, for mood regulation, right? Or taking the, omega-3s or the essential fatty acids and the role that plays in mental health. Or even during the pandemic, some doctors have been prescribing large doses of zinc and melatonin to their COVID patients. What's that about?
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, it's great that kind of work is being done. I kind of, again, go, ooh, that's just a single nutrient approach.
Yes.
And there's no reason why you wouldn't I would say, try the experiment of giving the full array of nutrients. Does it have to just be zinc? And so I think it's great that zinc alone is being shown to be of benefit. But I would go, well, let's even see if we can top that up and get an even greater benefit by giving the full array of nutrients because zinc doesn't operate on its own. So that's my response
Point
to
well taken.
Yeah.
So if you were to suggest to the average consumer key ingredients that can be found at the supermarket or at the farmer's market to improve mental health right now, what would you say? Go buy X.
Right. So again, no special secret superfood. So it's the array, it's the full array. So again, it's not hard to just know I need to eat food. Yeah, it's everything. I need to eat food that my great grandmother recognizes as food. So that's, and I used to say grandmother, but now I think we're at a point where it's probably your great grandmother. So that's your nuts, your seeds, your legumes, your fresh fruit and your vegetables. Your meat from the butcher, your fish, that's what we're talking about. Your whole grains, so that they're not really ultra processed, is much better than things like your white bread. Is not going to give you any nourishing whatsoever for your brain. But there's some wonderful breads out there, for example.
White substances. If any white food is probably white processed food is not what we want to be eating, right? Like the sugar, white flours.
Exactly. And when you do this, though, when you start to eat those foods, you don't need to worry about reading packages. And you don't need to be worried about getting in, how much sugar am I consuming? Because you're consuming then your sugar in a natural form.
Yeah.
You're not consuming it via an injection into a ultra processed food in the form of high fructose corn syrup, which is incredibly bad for us and doesn't provide us with anything really good at all for our brain health. So, but by just doing that, I'm trying to make it not complicated that you have to read the labels, because if you're eating real foods, then you're probably, there aren't labels.
There aren't any labels. Yeah.
There aren't any labels. So, I wouldn't be guided by the food, by some of the labels that are on foods that say this is, low in sugar or low in fat. I stay well away from anything that's advertising itself that way.
We say in our house, if you can't pronounce it, you probably shouldn't be eating it.
I think that's a good guideline overall. Yeah. So that's where I would start. And then learning more about the supplements is available also in the book about, because it's so confusing. It's like, well, what do I buy? So we provide all of the evidence-based supplements that have ever been researched for the benefit of mental health.
Oh.
So yeah, it's all in the book. So that's
all in the book. Let's give it a plug. The Better Brain.
Yeah.
The Better Brain. I mean, just give the whole thing. Overcome anxiety, combat depression, and reduce ADHD and stress with nutrition. And I want to plug this online course, this free online course that's available to anybody in any part of the world on edX. And they can enter your name, Julia J. Rucklidge, and have access to the course, which is a public health course on nutrition and mental health.
Absolutely. And it's bringing this information to anybody who's ready to sit down and learn. I mean, it's a time commitment to go through the course, but I've had already a lot of great feedback, and people are really excited about what they've been learning. So I think it'll be something that everybody can gain from, whether you're a professional trying to seek more information so you feel more confident about working with clients who are struggling with mental health issues, or you're a family member struggling with it, or you know someone. I think it's got something for everyone in there.
And what I also hear you say that's very important is that the synergistic reaction of these foods when they're eaten together. It's not just you're going to go on a kale diet. It's you're going to eat kale and beans and nuts and a little bit of meat and a little bit of fish and good oils and fats that help your brain and your body.
About olive oil. Yes. Good reminder.
Yes. Fat is our friend. Good quality, high quality fat is a good thing.
Avocados seem to be constantly in season in New Zealand. I'm not sure what happened over the last year, but they're super cheap. And so that's, and full of nourishing fats, as you say. Yeah.
And just so tasty and good for us. And, I love them personally, but it's not about me. It's about everybody else and them coming on board with this good nutrition. To learn more about your work, our listeners can also go to the, www.canterbury.ac.nz. And in the science department, there's a profile for you there. Julia Rucklidge. On Twitter, you're at Julia Rucklidge, and on Facebook at Mental Health and Nutrition. And once again, that free public health course is available on edX. And I salute you for writing this book and educating us and empowering us with tools to take charge of our mental health beyond the therapist's couch and beyond the prescription pad. This is just another set of tools.
Absolutely. And I like what you say, which is that it's empowering people so that they are in control of the change.
Yes.
And that there's things that they can do rather than just have to go and see a professional who's going to be the one who's going to, dole out the pills that unfortunately haven't helped enough people. And that's the bottom line.
True that. And when you look at the research about the efficacy of pharmacological pills, antidepressants, they say that lifestyle interventions, the research that I have read, that lifestyle interventions, including exercise and nutrition, nature bathing, so on and so forth, and talk therapy, work better than the pills.
Exactly. Yep.
So why not do that?
Exactly. Yes.
Thank you. This was fabulous. I had such a good time with you.
Oh, good.
Thanks for joining us on Harvesting Happiness today. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen and my guests, Dr. Judson Brewer and Professor Julia J. Rucklidge, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Go out and rock your day.
Keep harvesting your own happiness anytime and anywhere from the comfort of wherever you are. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes via our free app or from our libraries at toginet.com, iTunes, Google Play, and other fine podcast platforms. To learn more about Lisa's global consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Spread more joy by liking us on Facebook at Harvesting Happiness and following Lisa on Twitter at Lisa Kamen.